Welcome back to the Craftsman Online podcast. This is a weekly half-hour program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, and joining us on the pod this week is Worshipful Brother Andrew Martinez. He's a member of Annapolis Lodge number 89, also a member of the Board of Directors for the Masonic Charities of the great state of Maryland. Welcome to Craftsman Online, Brother Andrew.
Happy to be here.
I'm excited to have you here because I got a chance to see him give this presentation earlier this summer, and it was on pirates and Freemasonry. And we know the history of the Knights Templar. There's been tons of books, a lot of thought pieces written about this. It's one of the greatest stories, I imagine, that's ever been read or told by Freemasons. And the Templar story has had a lot of rumors and connections to other aspects throughout time, and one of them is pirates. And when I sat and watched your presentation, the first question that came to my mind was about pirates themselves. I don't think there's any man that would be listening to our podcast right now who didn't watch the Peter Pan movie growing up as a kid, or maybe the Pirates of the Caribbean films in the early 2000s. And I'm just curious where it all started with you as a young person. What drew you into having that interest in pirates?
Well, without fail, it has to be Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island. I mean, you read that book, and that's where a lot of the early folklore came about. I'm actually old enough that I actually remember reading also the Reader's Digest for The Curse of Oak Island when that first money pit thing came out. I wish I'd have kept that. It's worth a fortune on eBay. But you start looking at all these aspects, and I think I mentioned it the other day when we were in the presentation, is that I even dress up as a pirate at Ren Fair, and I actually have to tell people that, no, I'm not really a pirate, I'm a privateer. Because I actually, in the early days, I was a pirate, but now that I've had the Masonic part, it's like, I better make sure that this is all legal. So we can actually get into that to it in a little bit. But yeah, I've watched all the early films, all the Peter Pans, all the horrible movies that came out in the 70s and 80s. You definitely have to love the old Errol Flynn's. And then without fail, the Pirates of the Caribbean series have definitely morphed everybody's views on pirates. It's just a wonderful aspect. And you think about the freedom of it, definitely a lot of it shaped for me once you start looking at Jimmy Buffett, Pirate Looks at 40, you look at all those aspects. And it's just a magical lifestyle. Unfortunately, it's a horrible one for pirates because they know they're committing crimes and they know their life is pretty short. So that's pretty much where I started with that.
This is what I love about Freemasonry. I mean, besides the education and, the esoteric thought, but it's really connecting with brothers that have an interest in something that is so specialized, and then they share it with you. They share their passion, and you're like, yeah, man, I want to learn more about this. So obviously, as a young person, as a child, you were into pirates, and you followed this through your entire adult life, right?
I mean, I remember when it was when my wife and I were first together. We weren't even married yet. We were at the Maryland Renaissance Festival, and I had an outfit pretty much close to Jack Sparrow. And all of a sudden, I took second in the contest for costumes. And I've definitely carried it on since then. It's always fun when I go there now and somebody yells, "Pirate!" And I'm like, no, privateer. I steal legally, like Congress. I mean, it's just those aspects that people just kind of wonder about. But I mean, I think all of us brothers have different alternate lifestyles from just outside from Freemasonic Brotherhood. We get a little stiff sometimes in meeting, and sometimes the meetings outside of the meetings are the best meetings because that's when you really get to see the guys actually be who they really are.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, my favorite thing is talking with brothers like you, and we're going to get into it now, that have always followed something that's their interest, and they're able to make that Masonic connection. So you talked about one of probably the best known fictionalized pirates of all time. And this is what saddened me a little bit. It was during your presentation, you said Johnny Depp's impersonation of what a pirate would have been like is really not what they were like at all. So take us back to that golden age of piracy, and who were these men? What were they like?
Jack Sparrow was actually monitored off of a real pirate, John Ward. And he was not a Caribbean pirate. He was a Mediterranean pirate. He was operated outside of Tunis. And when Johnny Depp came up with the character, he actually had a couple things in mind. He wanted him to be more like a rock star. So that's why you see Keith Richards show up in, I think it was the third one, and you see him in the aspect. And he kind of mirrored a lot of how he acted off of Keith Richards. But apparently in the real pirate, John Ward, he was actually known as Jack, and he was also known as the Sparrow. So I thank you for asking these questions, because it actually made me go back and review some of the things that I've been looking at. I mean, there's always the Hollywood aspect of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Actually, one of the series that I like a lot more, that actually brings in a lot of the other books, is Black Sails, the four-season series. That actually hits things a little bit more. But in the Pirates of the Caribbean series, is that they definitely took a lot of the aspects of all Disney, but a lot of the aspects of pirates, and slammed it together. I mean, there was historical aspects. You do see the East India Trading Company. You do see the fact that the British are hunting down pirates, definitely making sure they hit the gallows. And you definitely see the other aspect of that, which is the Asian aspect. You see the Singapore, the Madagascar aspects that you don't really talk about a lot. But John Ward, apparently, in quotes, dressed rather curious, and that aspect was rather flamboyant. And I think Johnny did a lot of that. One of the other things that I thought was interesting about Johnny Depp is that he based his character off of Pepe Le Pew. The fact that he was favored himself a ladies' man while he was a skunk and a scoundrel. And it's kind of interesting that he actually did that.
I just thought he was doing the world's greatest Keith Richards impersonation, a rum-soaked pirate. And the one thing about Disney is they do Disneyfy history when they tell these stories. So we're talking about the 1650s and 1730s. If you're thinking about the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, what was really going on in the real world at that time?
So the golden age of piracy definitely was, like you said, 1650 to 1730. And then you see the overlap of the other aspect of that, is that this was also the age of the tail end of the age of exploration, but also the beginning of the age of enlightenment. Exploration ends about the same time enlightenment comes around, which is about 1680, which runs all the way through about 1790. And so the one thing that you see that overlaps all these aspects is that in the Caribbean, you have the exploration of the New World. Spain has already conquered South America. They've already established a foothold in America. They already had a colony at St. Augustine in 1545. You know that the English were here. Raleigh was 1590, and then you had Jamestown in 1607. So you had all these aspects, and it was a whole new world. But you had all these treasure fleets coming out of South America that were just taking the gold from the American Indians in Central and South America and transporting them north, hitting the whole Gulf Stream current and bringing them back around to the old world. And that meant the opportunity for people to get rich quick. I mean, a lot of times these galleons were, even though they were heavily armed, a lot of times they would hit tropical storms. You get a couple pirate ships together that would actually descend on these things because it was get rich quick. And so that was what you were seeing in the New World this time. I don't want to leave off the other part of the aspect, is that there was a lot of piracy going on around Madagascar and the Indian Ocean. And you see a lot of the Asiatic trade going on that side. One of the main central characters that brings that all together is Captain Kidd, one of the well-known pirates of that age. He was actually a gentleman out of New York City, and he would have known all the folks that were downtown. He actually lent a lot of his block and tackle to building the main church in New York. And then he eventually went around, got enough money together to put the ship together to go raiding on these ships. And eventually one of the things did not turn out the way he expected it. He went out privateering and actually got called pirate, and then got brought up on charges and hung.
And that's basically when the term became popular, when they kind of use that on him, pirate.
Well, actually, pirate, if you think about the term, has actually been around since the Greeks. Pirata, which means to attempt, which is an interesting aspect to this story, is that when you think about cutthroat, you think bad guys, you think all these things that live by rules. But then when you get into the talking about privateers, they basically were allowed by their country to go out and raid in the name of sovereignty. They were allowed to go out legally with a letter of marque and actually go out and heist money for the early colonies, eventually the United States, France, England, Spain, Portugal. I mean, they're all basically just stealing. And if we want to tie this all the way back to the Knights Templar aspect, you look at the Knights Hospitaller. They basically raided Muslim ships in the Mediterranean from about 1100 until about 1500. So you're talking about years of people just stealing from people. And so the whole term pirate is just stealing on the high seas.
Let's get to that point, because I love that you have this background. I love that you have this knowledge. You get into Freemasonry back in 19 and now you're sitting there in Blue Lodge. And this is where I always wish I was next to the guy when this moment happened, where you're like, oh, that's a connection. That is a Masonic connection to this thing that I followed my entire life. I need to go home and find a book, or I need to reach out to an older brother to make sure that I'm hearing this right. Where did you first make that tie-in?
I guess the first connection was reading Robinson's Born in Blood, where that one sentence in the beginning where it says, "This too make you a brother of pirates and corsairs." And then he doesn't mention it through the rest of the book. He goes off in this tangent about the Peasants' Revolt, the word Tyler, and all these other things, hoodwinked, all these other aspects of the fraternity and their connection back to Templars. But he never really hits that. And so that's actually when I dove into this. This was a paper that I did for the Masonic Rosicrucians. And it was just like, okay, what did he mean by that? And as I started going down that rabbit hole, it was all of a sudden the lights started popping on left and right. It was like, oh, we talk about certain things in our obligations in the EA degree, the Fellowcraft degree, the Master Mason. And when you look into certain aspect, there's a book called Bygone Punishments. It was written in 1899. But you look at early maritime punishments, and they are exact mirrors of our Masonic obligation penalties for the first, second, and third degree. And so that started taking it down a rabbit hole that, okay, who would have known about these things? Well, everybody, because penalties were just across the board. You think about the Inquisition, which would have been known through Spain, Portugal, would have gone all over Europe. And so you would have seen things like pincers pulling out tongues and people being eviscerated and all these other aspects. People would have known stockades for this and hanging for that. And all of a sudden it's universal justice that comes across. And I think there's a reason why our penalties were written that way. It's because you look at these aspects, they were universally known.
That's the one thing when I saw your presentation in a lodge meeting and you put that line up from Robinson's book, Born in Blood. And I read that about 3 years ago. And I was telling you, after the meeting, basically I bought it at thrift store and it was on sale for $5. And I just felt like, if anyone's going to own this for $5, it should be a Freemason. So I bought it and it sat on my bookshelf for years. I finally picked it up and I started reading it. And like you, I thought he was going to get right into this Knights Templar Freemasonry connection. And it's a very slow read, but there's a lot of history that really kind of begins with the fall of Acre and what happened with the Templars, and then you get into the French King, and then finally we get into where things went with the connection between the Templars and Freemasons. Don't want to spoil the book for others that are getting into it. But what impressed me was that I had also heard that a significant portion of his research was actually done at the Masonic Library at the Grand Lodge in New York, which I was very impressed with. He was at the Livingston Library. How much of that connection, because, you have a passion, that might make you predisposed to have a bias into it. Do you agree with him on some of this research that fugitive Templars in 1314 could eventually become the first quote unquote pirates of the high seas?
So it's funny that we're talking about this, because I just rewatched, we were talking about Scott Walter earlier, that he actually has a series called Pirates, the Knights Templar Treasure. If you get a chance to watch it, it's a 6-part series. It's on the History Channel. It's on YouTube if you want to catch it. I thought it was interesting when you talk about all the lineage, that the one thing that ties this through is the symbols. So when you start looking at going back to the Knights Templar and the rumors of, they were on the Temple Mount, they were in King Solomon's Temple, they went down below, they came up with all this treasure. You see this aspect of a storytelling in our ritual that goes from Blue Lodge to chapter to council to commandery, if you want to go up to the York Rite stream. And definitely Pike hits a lot of this too for Scottish Rite. But you see elements of this that have been passed through. And so you talk about the Knights Templar. There was knowledge apparently that they got from King Solomon's Temple. One of the things we talk about in Blue Lodge is the building of the temple. The fact that they found money, they found sacred symbols, wisdom. And then a lot of that transferred west. And then you see the golden age of cathedral building, because none of those big cathedrals existed before that. How did that happen? Like, you had a lot of masons that knew how to do angles and this, that, and the other. But you watch that knowledge transfer from Jerusalem to Acre to Rhodes to Malta up to La Rochelle. You see the whole spread through Europe aspect while the Knights Templar were in power, and then eventually Philip the Fair wipes them out. And then you hear the whole rumor of the treasure fleet leaving, Marseille, and heading out somewhere. And a lot of speculation that they ended up in Scotland and whatnot. But an aspect of that, you look at a lot of the symbolism, and I can't really go into a lot of it because I don't want to ruin anybody's experience, and I don't want to allow the profane to know what our ritual is about. But you see a lot of these themes run through the chapter, the council, and then eventually the commandery, which is the Order of the Temple.
I'll talk about two symbols that I think are fair game for people in and outside of Freemasonry. One of them you kind of get used to seeing in a Masonic lodge, which is that of a coffin. And you understand when you go through the degrees, the reverence to that and the meaning for that. The other one, when you first come into a Masonic lodge, you look at it and you go, pirates? Why is there a skull and crossbone in Masonry? Like, that's interesting. And this is one of my favorite parts, when you bring in men that are interested in joining the fraternity, and they first step into a Masonic lodge, and they're like, okay, this is not kind of what I expected, or maybe I've seen pictures of one online, and then they see that symbol. I remember the first time I attended a lodge of remembrance, and I saw the skull and the crossbones and was a part of that lecture. What did this mean to pirates? Do you find any possible connection between what they would have thought and what values we would have held with the skull and crossbones?
We look back at the skull and crossbones as a flag or as a symbol. There's definitely Knights Templar connections there. You look at Golgotha, where Christ died. It was the place of the bones. And you see a lot of skulls and crossbones on crucifixes and in a lot of paintings and symbols that reflect back to that. You also see the skull and crossbones evolve about 1200. Roger of Italy, who was one of the sponsors, he was known as Jolly Roger for the parties that he threw. He was one of the main sponsors for the Knights Templar. And there's a lot of speculation that his flag, which was the skull and crossbones, was flown on a lot of the galleys that the Knights Hospitaller would have used. Then you see the fact that there's a black flag being hoisted along seacoast towns in the Mediterranean when pirates were coming up through the shores. And remember, we wind this back a little, is that it means to attempt and to steal, if you look from the Greek, that it didn't have to exactly be any particular nationality or group. It just meant there was raiders coming. So you see the universality of this flag, and then eventually the skull and crossbones on it. There's a lot of speculation that those ships that raided Muslim ships and other aspects from the Knights Hospitaller aspect eventually transfers over to being a universal raider symbol. So tying that to Freemasonry is that it means imminent death. If you think about it, if you look at Memento Mori, which is the reminder that you too shall die. If you look at it in the Chamber of Reflection for a lot of the ritual, it means to Masons that, hey, keep things in check, because you know what? You're going to die at eventual point in time. And so, like you said, that it's on coffins. We see it on tracing boards. And that symbol comes up a lot in our Freemasonic aspects.
Just to kind of recap, because we talked a lot about, the myths, and we're kind of breaking some of those down, and also kind of establishing some of the fact and the fiction. And I'm one of those people that's like, okay, I can see how in 1314, if the story that Robinson laid out is pretty much how it went down with the Templars, and imagine being distant and finding out that your order has been sacked, your leader has been basically persecuted, burned alive at the stake. You're now a fugitive. You have or you don't have this treasure. This treasure could have been gold, it could have been knowledge, or it could have just been some sort of information that the King of France didn't want you to have, and now you're on the run. And you also happen to have ties with other brother knights who have had a history of raiding and pillaging and sacking other ships. And I think that is one of the neat myths that you broke down, is that in the movies, we always see the pirates, pulling up next to each other and blowing the ships apart. But in your presentation, that's not what happened.
It doesn't. I mean, you look at most of piracy, it was intimidation. And that's one of the other aspects about talking about the skull and crossbones, is that 9 times out of 10, if you saw that flag, you knew there was probably 2 or 3 other pirate ships nearby. You knew that you were probably alone. And a lot of times it meant you were going to be boarded. And so piracy used a lot of intimidation. They didn't want to sink their treasure. I mean, you think about it, if you sink the ship that you're trying to capture, you've just lost all the goods that are on board, as well as the possibility of bartering the hostages that would be taken from it, especially if there were nobility or some other aspect. So a lot of times it was just, hey, we're going to hoist this flag and see what happens. And now there's another aspect to that. If you look at like French literature, the Jolly Rouge, which means the red flag. A lot of times, if you saw the skull and crossbones, or black flag for that aspect, it meant pirates. You were given a choice. However, if that same ship ran up the red flag, it meant there was going to be no mercy. So rather than take the chance of being completely wiped out, once you saw the skull and crossbones, it was like, okay, hands up, we're done. Take what you want, just let us have our lives. So it didn't really make a lot of sense to blow up what you're trying to capture.
And another big fictionalized piece of pirates is that they're these wild swashbucklers that are like the gunslingers on the ocean, when in fact, pirates actually had a code that you share in your presentation. They had rules.
Yes, they did. Matter of fact, it's very Freemasonic in that aspect, is that the captains were always elected, just like we have elections. And it was equal danger for equal pay. There was no women allowed on board. The musicians were allowed certain aspects, extra pay. Those that had lost a limb were given extra shares. I mean, it was very much a democracy in its basic sense, that it was the vote of the majority. It wasn't really a republic. It wasn't really laws. I mean, there's that one classic line from Pirates of the Caribbean where Barbosa goes, they're more like guidelines for the pirate code. It's not really, okay, these aren't written in stone. These are kind of like the white lines on the sides of the highway. And so it really kept a lot of order on the ships. But the captains knew that if they overstepped their bounds, they could be just as marooned, going back to Pirates of the Caribbean, Johnny gets set on the island, but they could be just as much demoted as fast as anybody else on the ship. They had to provide. And so that happens a lot in our lodges too. The worshipful master is basically, it's an inverted triangle. The worshipful master is at the bottom, and he's holding up the rest of it. He has to keep all the membership happy and keep everything going pretty smoothly.
Just trying to think, do we have parlay in Masonic lodges? Maybe for another episode we can get into that one. So there were 2 slides that you had put up during the presentation, and you touched on one of them, which was kind of the map, which you could say was almost like the escape route from Africa, the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, all the way through up to the Mediterranean. And then they kind of end at this one place. And when you put the slide up, everybody that knows goes, whoa, we got to talk about the pirate Templar connection with the history of the Rosslyn Chapel.
So that's an interesting aspect. Going back to another part of our fraternity is that when you look at the York Rite route, going through chapter council and then eventually commander, which leads to the Order of the Temple, I'm getting currently ready to confer the Order of the Red Cross. And I thought it was interesting just the other day that I'm reading through it. All of a sudden, I'm reading another book on Rosslyn Chapel Decoded. And the theme that comes up in the lesson that we're supposed to learn in Order of the Red Cross is actually the only Latin words that are written in Rosslyn Chapel. So there's a connection there with the words as Zerubbabel. I won't get into it. I won't ruin it for anybody, and definitely keep that in check. But for as Rosslyn Chapel goes, I mean, you think about it, they always wondered where the treasure fleets ended. And there's a speculation that some of the Knights Templar did end up in Scotland, because Scotland at the time was basically outside of the purview of the Pope. And it was basically a nice refuge for anybody that wanted to be outside of what the demands were. England was definitely within playing along, but Scotland wasn't. And if you look at all those connections, you look at tracing it down further, you look at the symbolism in Rosslyn Chapel, you see a lot of Freemasonic aspects. Everybody knows about the apprentice pillar, and everybody knows about the Mason's pillar. But you see all these other aspects of the stories, all the other aspects that lead kind of aspects to the New World exploration. I'm sure probably some of the listeners have definitely watched Curse of Oak Island, where there's a lot of speculation that that's where a lot of the Templar treasure ended up, in this giant 100-foot well that they've been spending millions and millions of dollars trying to excavate. But going back to Rosslyn Chapel, you look at the Sinclair family, their relations to Templary, and it's highly possible or probable that they did house some fugitives. I mean, there are stories from Robert the Bruce where these men on horses, that's pretty much where I'm going to go with that at this point in time. I don't want to get into a lot of speculation, lead people down the wrong paths. I want people to actually draw their own connections. But for me, there's a lot of connections through all the stories, because if you look at it from a historical timeline, all the pieces fit. And when you get that kind of fit, I mean, if you look at Colin Powell's 40 to 70% range of, I think it's in there, you kind of start seeing how these aspects will work.
That's a perfect way of putting it. I like to think of the perspective, it shifts in your mind, and when you hear Scott Walter talk about things and how a stone that is found in a farmer's field in Minnesota unlocks some of the greatest ideas to challenge one of the biggest stories that we've ever heard in life. That's pretty powerful, and it's interesting, and it's always fascinating, and it's special to me that we can kind of, as Freemasons, understand some of that and have a little unique part of that history. I'm sure it's one you've been asked a million times, and brothers have just been so disappointed to hear the answer to this one. But do you have any records of any famous Freemasons who were pirates, or pirates who became maybe Freemasons later in life somehow?
The funny aspect to that is that you kind of have to look at what does pirate mean? And it basically just means stealing on the high sea. Now, the fraternity does have this aspect of morality that we teach. So being a complete cutthroat really doesn't fit that model. However, if we rewind a little and go back to the aspect of stealing legally in the name of a nation and fighting for those causes, then we really have to look at what privateers are, which were basically legal pirates. They operated under letters of marque. I mean, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, legal piracy is still in it. I mean, I can't remember the name of the chapter and verse, but the ability to raise a privateer fleet is like 2 or 3 steps ahead of actually raising a real navy for this country. And so if you start looking at that aspect, you definitely can look at about the era of the Revolutionary War, through the War of 1812. And you see definitely one brother that everybody knows that's buried in Annapolis, and that's John Paul Jones. He was a brother, and he was one of the most menacing privateers during the Revolution. It's actually interesting that he actually came over to fight for our country after he was accused of murdering 2 people or killing 2 people in England. It doesn't mean there's a saying that some of the brothers probably persecute me for this, is that not all good men are Masons, but not all Masons are good men. So you kind of look at those aspects. But John Paul Jones, he definitely took a lot of initiative during the war. He definitely, because when you got to look back at the Revolutionary War, we only had 2 ships to start with. And you look at Adams and all the others saying the only way we were going to be able to compete with Great Britain at that time was to have a privateer fleet, because we didn't have to build ships, even though we were building ships. We didn't have to raise crews. We just had to offer them incentive to go out and raid the British, cause them problems. And John Paul Jones did. Matter of fact, they're getting ready to have an anniversary of one of the ships that he sunk off of the coast of England itself. I mean, he went all the way around the Atlantic to actually cause as much havoc as he could. You look at also Thomas Truxton. He was a privateer during the Revolution. Eventually goes on to be the Commodore of the U.S. Navy afterwards. He was a good friend of George Washington. He was raised in a military lodge. I do believe it was in Crown Point in New York. And he's actually got a place down here in Annapolis, Truxton Square. And he was the captain of the Constellation, not the first one, the second one. And he took, I do believe, 6 ships, privateer, took 6 ships during the Revolution. Interestingly enough, going back to Robinson's book, This Too Will Make You Brother, Pirates and Corsairs, is that he was one of the U.S. Navy ships that actually fought with the Barbary coast pirates, who were Corsairs in the Mediterranean. Another famous Freemason that was a privateer was Dominic Yu. He was a Mason in France before coming to becoming a member of one of the lodges in New Orleans. He basically raided Spanish ships early 1800s, and eventually he was pardoned by brother Andrew Jackson in order to have him and his crew fight to save New Orleans, and he did so very valiantly. You can actually go see his mausoleum down in New Orleans, and there's actually the square and compasses on it. And then probably the last one to kind of tie things around is James Anderson. Going back to Curse of Oak Island, he's one of the main focus characters in that series. He was a privateer for the early budding colonials. There's a lot of speculation that he was raised in Baltimore, one of the 2 lodges that existed at that time. Interesting story about him is that he eventually switched sides during the Revolution and became a loyalist again. He privateered for the British. His original ship was the Baltimore, and then I don't know what ship he had after that. And so much so that after the war, Thomas Jefferson wanted him hung for treason. And don't know how, I don't lead to any speculation, but he basically got away and made it up to New York, where he was basically put with some of the other loyalists. They made it up to Nova Scotia, to the Oak Island area, and he eventually became a brother with Chestertown Lodge, I do believe, number 9. And then eventually he dies down in the West Indies in 1796. But they definitely put it all together. There's definitely, when you look at that episode about him, it talks about him being accepted as a brother by the Worship Master, the Junior Warden, and Secretary. So we do have aspects, we do see brothers as quote unquote pirates, but more privateer. And then you also have to remember, privateers were treated as pirates if they were caught.
And they also win costume contests at Renaissance festivals.
Yes, they do.
Quite popular with the ladies, from what I hear. Brother Andrew Martinez, thank you so much for coming on this episode of Craftsman Online.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
If Masonic education is important to you, you can sign up to receive our email newsletter at craftsmanonline.com. A reminder that new episodes of our podcast are available for download every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail. I'm not going to lie, in preparation for this podcast, I listened to the Pirates of the Caribbean soundtrack almost on like a nonstop loop for the past week. So I have that dun, 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 dun. Every time you start talking about pirates, it's going in my head.